The morning sun over Nanking burned through the smoke of another conquered city as Lieutenant Takahashi Kenji guided his Mitsubishi A6M0. Through the golden haze below him, columns of black smoke rose like twisted fingers reaching toward the sky, the silent remains of a Chinese airfield. His radio crackled with laughter from other pilots in his squadron. They were untouchable. They were the wings of the Emperor. Kenji tilted his head slightly, glancing at the shimmering aluminum skin of his new machine. It was light, impossibly light. When he pulled the stick back, the aircraft climbed like a living thing, obedient and effortless. This, he thought, is what it must feel like to be a god. The Zero had made its combat debut only weeks earlier, and already its legend was spreading across Asia. It could outclimb anything in the sky, turn inside an opponent in seconds, and travel distances other aircraft could only dream of. At 530 kilometers per hour, it was faster than the British Hurricane, more agile than the American P-40, and could fly 3,000 kilometers without refueling. Pilots who once fought cautious dogfights now hunted with arrogance, convinced the Zero was invincible. In 1940, Japan's military doctrine called for speed, range, and surprise. The Zero delivered all three. To its pilots, it was not just an airplane, it was proof of Japan's destiny to dominate the Pacific. Over the radio, Kenji's wingman shouted, "They cannot touch us. We are the sky itself." They laughed as they dived together, their 20-millimeter cannons tearing through the helpless Chinese fighters below. The battles were often over before they began. Ground crews at captured airfields whispered that these Japanese machines could turn in half the space of any Western plane. American and British observers sent reports home describing a mysterious new aircraft that defied the laws of physics. But to the Japanese, there was no mystery. It was the result of faith, precision, and a willingness to sacrifice. The engineers at Mitsubishi had created something that reflected the soul of their empire. Pure speed born from purity of purpose. In Tokyo, newspapers printed photographs of smiling young pilots beside their gleaming Zeros. The rising sun painted proudly on the tail. The invincible sky samurai, the headlines declared. In the mesh halls of carriers, Akagi and Kaga pilots toasted with sake, swearing that no foreign plane could match them. Even senior officers began to believe their own myth. The Zero was more than a weapon. It was a prophecy with wings. Yet hidden beneath that flawless confidence was a truth none of them could see. Every victory carried a silent cost, measured not in fuel or bullets, but in the thin sheets of aluminum that separated life from death. Lieutenant Takahashi could not have known that the very lightness that made his fighter dance in the clouds would one day become its curse. He could not have known that his empire's obsession with range and agility had built an aircraft without armor, without protection, without forgiveness. But on that morning over China, he felt only power. When his squadron returned to base, the ground crews cheered and bowed as the Zeros rolled to a stop, their engines ticking in the heat. Kenji climbed out of the cockpit, sunlight shining off the metal, and whispered to a young mechanic, "No one can stop us now." The boy smiled, believing it too. For a moment, the world seemed to agree. The sun was still rising for Japan, and the Zero was its burning chariot. In Tokyo, the air smelled like rain and hot metal as Jiro Horikoshi stood on the assembly floor of Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant, staring at the line of unfinished Zeros shining under the fluorescent lights. Outside, the nation celebrated. Newspapers hailed the victory at Pearl Harbor as proof from the gods that the rising sun could never set. But Horikoshi, the quiet man who had designed the aircraft that made it possible, felt no triumph. He ran his hand along the curved body of one incomplete Zero, feeling the thinness of its skin under his palm. It bent under pressure, fragile like a soda can. This, he thought, is not steel. It is faith made of aluminum. The engineers had followed his instructions exactly. Every gram was counted, every bolt, rivet, and cable had been shaved down to the bare minimum. No self-sealing fuel tanks, no cockpit armor, no bulletproof glass. Even the wiring insulation had been reduced to save weight. The Zero's genius was its lightness, and its curse was the same. When Horikoshi first showed the design in 1939, naval officers had balked. No armor, they asked, no protection for the pilot. He answered calmly, "If we add armor, it will not meet the range requirement. If we make it safe, it will not be a Zero." He had not meant to sound cruel, yet his words became a prophecy. By December 1941, the Zero's legend had left all doubts behind. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, it swept across the Pacific like a storm, Philippines, Malaya, Burma. The Dutch East Indies, Allied pilots who saw it for the first time, said it was impossible to kill. In truth, it was only untouchable as long as no one could reach it. Its long wings and very light construction gave it a range of nearly 1,200 miles, twice that of its American rivals. That range was the difference between victory and defeat for a nation without oil, without steel, and without the luxury to lose planes. The Zero could fight and come home when every other aircraft would have fallen into the sea. Our calculations had been correct. The Empire's need for distance had demanded a plane that put performance above safety. He remembered the meeting with the Naval Air Bureau 2 years before. The officers had given their impossible list of demands: a top speed of 310 miles per hour, a climb rate of 3,000 feet per minute, a combat radius of 1,000 miles, and the agility of a dragonfly. No aircraft in the world can do this. Horikoshi had said. The admiral had smiled. Then build one that can, and he had. Through clever thinking, obsession, and countless sleepless nights, he had built the perfect flying blade, sharp, beautiful, and dangerously thin. His notebook still carried the weight, calculations, and neat columns: armor plating, 200 kilograms, self-sealing tanks, 150 kilograms, pilot seat reinforcement, 70 kilograms, each number circled in red, then crossed out. Remove armor, gain range; remove protection, gain speed; remove humanity, gain victory. When news of Pearl Harbor reached the factory, workers cheered, throwing their caps in the air. Horikoshi stood apart, watching the celebration. He felt no joy, only exhaustion. He knew the truth behind the headlines. The Zero's brilliance was built on the illusion of invincibility, and illusions are fragile things. They call it perfect, he told his assistant, but it is perfect only if no one shoots back. The assistant laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. It was not. Months later, as reports from the front arrived, Horikoshi began to read about the losses. Pilots burned alive when tracer rounds hit their unprotected fuel tanks. Entire squadrons vanished after a single burst of cannon fire. And yet the command praised the aircraft's lightness, its purity. One officer had said, "Better to die as fire than live in shadow." Horikoshi stopped reading the reports after that. He no longer wanted to know how many of his creations had become coffins in the sky. He visited the shrine at Yasukuno. In silence, rows of paper lanterns glowed in the winter wind, each marked with the name of a fallen pilot. He recognized some of them. Test pilots, friends, young men who had once posed proudly beside his prototype. He whispered their names one by one. "Forgive me," he said. The next morning, production resumed. The war machine did not pause for regret, yet deep inside the factory, Horikoshi changed one thing. He ordered that the aluminum used for the cowling be polished to a mirror finish. "If they must die," he said quietly, "let them at least shine." The fog never lifted that summer over the Aleutian Islands. Wind howled across the black volcanic hills, and sheets of mist rolled in from the sea like ghosts. On June 10, 1942, a patrol from the U.S. Navy trudged through the bog near Dutch Harbor, searching for debris from the recent Japanese raid. What they found instead would change everything they thought they knew about the enemy. Half buried in the mud lay an intact Mitsubishi, a 6M0. Its white body was smeared with oil and dirt, its red rising sun still bright under the grime. The pilot, a young Japanese ensign, was dead, his neck broken in the crash. He had tried to blow himself up, but the bomb did not go off. The plane had survived. When the patrol radioed the discovery, the message was marked urgent and sent coded for immediate transfer to naval intelligence. Within days, the aircraft was carefully taken apart, loaded onto a transport ship, and sent under armed guard to San Diego. The Americans called it the Otane Zero. They did not yet realize it was the most valuable prize of the Pacific War. In the sealed hangars of the Naval Air Test Center, engineers gathered around the strange, slender machine like archaeologists uncovering a relic from another world. Major Eddie Sanders, the test pilot assigned to examine it, remembered his first impression clearly. It looked fragile, he wrote, almost delicate, like something built for air, shows not for war. The team began their inspection. What they found was unbelievable. The outer skin was less than 1 millimeter thick, so thin that pressing a screwdriver against it left a dent. There was no armor behind the pilot seat, no bulletproof glass, no self-sealing rubber lining on the fuel tanks. The controls were simple, even crude, but the craftsmanship was amazing. Rivets lined up perfectly. The wing spars, made of high-grade aluminum, were polished like mirrors. Every part had been stripped of extra weight until nothing unnecessary remained. God Almighty, one mechanic whispered, they fly combat in this. Sanders tapped a wing with his knuckle. The hollow sound was like hitting a tin can. They do, he said, and they win. As they worked, the pattern became clear. Every ounce of protection had been given up for performance. The Zero's empty weight was barely 3,700 pounds, nearly 2,000 pounds lighter than the American Wildcat. Its range of 1,200 miles came from huge fuel tanks that filled the wings completely unprotected. The slightest hit from incendiary rounds would turn the whole aircraft into a torch. But before that hit came, the Zero could fly circles around anything in the sky. The trade-off was terrifyingly efficient. Over the next weeks, the Americans rebuilt the plane to flying condition. Sanders climbed into the cockpit on September 20th, 1942, and took off from North Island Airfield. For the first few minutes, the Zero handled like nothing he had ever flown. It climbed effortlessly, banked without resistance, and seemed to know what he wanted. It was alive, he said later. But as he pushed the throttle, the illusion broke. At high speeds, the controls stiffened. The wings bent dangerously. In dives, it shook, threatening to tear itself apart. Its beauty was only on the surface, a machine made for gods, not for mortals who bled. The engineers recorded everything. Their report would change American fighter tactics for the rest of the war. The Japanese Zero, it read, is a paradox unmatched in agility, yet fatally fragile. It is a masterpiece of engineering that does the impossible by ignoring reason. Diagrams showed every flaw: the unprotected fuel tanks, the lack of armor, the overextended wings. When the data reached the design teams at Grumman and VA, they knew what had to change. The new American fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, would have thicker skin, heavier armor, and self-sealing tanks, trading range for survival. But inside that hangar in San Diego, as technicians traced bullet paths on the captured fuselage, a silence settled over the men. They realized what the Japanese engineers had done. It wasn't madness, it was faith. The Zero's designers had trusted their pilots to die beautifully rather than come back wounded. They had built not just an airplane, but a philosophy made of metal. As the Auton Zero was wheeled into storage after its final test flight, Sanders turned to a fellow officer. They built perfection, he said quietly. But it is the kind of perfection that kills its own. That night, on the last page of the test report, a single line was added in pencil. If war is mathematics, then the Japanese have solved the wrong equation. By early 1943, the Auton was no longer a mystery, it was a revelation. Every line, every rivet, every gram of aluminum had been measured, weighed, and understood. To American engineers, it was as if they had cracked an enemy's code, not in language but in logic. The Zero was more than an airplane. It was a philosophy built into metal, a reflection of how Japan saw war, sacrifice, and the value of human life. Now, in the quiet hangars of San Diego, that philosophy was being taken apart and rebuilt into something completely different. At Grumman Aircraft Engineering in Bethpage, New York, a young engineer named Bill Schwendler stood before a chalkboard filled with equations and diagrams. Around him, the drafting room buzzed with the sound of pencils, scratching rulers, sliding papers. A symphony of American industry waking up to the challenge. On the board and underlined twice were 4 words: survivability is performance. Schwendler pointed to them as he spoke to his team. We've studied the Japanese Zero, he said. We know why it is fast, we know why it is deadly, but we also know why it dies. Our job isn't to copy it, it's to outlive it. What the engineers learned from the Auton report was simple and harsh. Every ounce of protection the Zero had given up for speed, every bit of armor it had discarded for range had cost Japan its future. The United States, with its industrial power, did not have to make the same sacrifices. It could afford to build machines that were heavier, slower on paper, but unstoppable in the sky. The new design, named XF-6F, what would soon become the Hellcat, was born from that logic. It was the anti-Zero. If the Japanese fighter showed fragility, wrapped in grace, the Hellcat was pure defiance, a 12,400-pound fortress with self-sealing fuel tanks, bulletproof glass, and armor thick enough to stop a 20-millimeter shell. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, and its wide wings carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns. It could take hits that would have destroyed a Zero and still bring its pilot home. When the prototype first flew in June 1942, pilots complained that it felt heavy and rough compared to the Japanese fighter. Good Schwendler replied, "That means it's strong, the man flying it is coming back." It became the unspoken motto of American aircraft design: power and protection. First elegance, later. But building better airplanes was only part of the lesson. The Zero had also changed the American way of thinking about air combat. Pilots who faced it in 1942 learned the hard way that dogfighting a twisting, turning ballet of agility was suicide against a zero turning meant death. The Auten test reports showed why, at low speeds and tight angles, the Zero's huge wings and very light frame gave it an unbeatable advantage. But the same design made it unstable in dives and slow and high-speed moves. Those weaknesses became the base of a new American strategy. Flight instructors made it into a single rule: don't fight the Zero where it wants to fight, attack from above. Dive fast, shoot once, and climb away before it can turn. It was not art, it was geometry. A war of math, not myth. The Americans called it boom and zoom, and it turned the sky from a stage of show into an arena of precise attacks. In the Pacific, the strategy spread fast. At Guadalcanal, Wildcat pilots who once died in spinning dogfights now survived by using height and discipline. The same pilots who had once complained about their heavier planes began to praise them. "The Zero's faster in a turn," one said, "but I can take a hit and come home. That's the only speed that matters." When the first Hellcats reached the carriers in 1943, the balance of the Pacific War changed overnight. The results were merciless. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, 373 Japanese planes were shot down in one day, many of them Zeros. The kill ratio was 19-1. American pilots came back with stories that were hard to believe. "We hit them once and they vanished," wrote one Navy aviator. It was like shooting at paper lanterns full of fuel. For Japan, it was more than defeat. It was the fall of an idea. The very perfection that had once made the Zero untouchable now made it a relic. In the war rooms of Washington, analysts saw a simple truth. Japan's engineers had built a plane for short wars of surprise, not long wars of attrition. America had built for the opposite. The difference was not technology, it was philosophy. The Zero's makers believed the pilot spirit was stronger than armor, that purity of design could defy physics. The Americans believed something colder and in the end more lasting, that survival was victory. Inside the Bureau of Aeronautics, an admiral summed it up in one line that would echo through the next generation of aircraft design: "The Japanese build planes to die beautifully. Well, build ours to live ugly." It was not mockery, it was clarity. The war had become an industrial equation, and the side that could replace its machines and keep its pilots alive would win. At Lockheed, Grumman, and VA, that philosophy became law. Aircraft frames got thicker, armor weight increased, and engines grew huge. The American factories worked around the clock, making wings not for beauty, but for endurance. Each Hellcat rolling off the line was a direct answer to the Auten Zero, a statement that reason had beaten faith. Yet among the engineers who studied the captured fighter, there was quiet respect for what they had found. They admired its purity, its elegance, its daring. It had been built not by fools but by dreamers. "They reached too far," one engineer wrote in his notebook, "but for a moment they touched perfection." In San Diego, the Auten Zero was finally put into storage, its aluminum skin dulled by fingerprints and dust. Major Eddie Sanders, the test pilot who first flew, it visited one last time before shipping out to the Pacific. He walked slowly around the plane, his hand trailing along the thin metal of the fuselage. "It was never evil," he murmured, "just too honest about what it was." He paused, looking at the bullet holes patched with tape from the test flights. "We built ours to survive. They built theirs to be remembered." He signed the maintenance log one last time and closed it gently. The hangar doors slid shut behind him with a heavy metallic clang that echoed like the end of an era. Outside, the California sun shone bright against the hangars, the same sun that had once risen over Japan's empire. But now it showed a different truth, one made not in beauty but in endurance. That was the real lesson of the Auten Zero. The Americans had not just copied their enemy. They had studied him, understood him, and learned from his mistakes. They had turned the enemy's brilliance into a blueprint for victory. And as new squadrons of Hellcats roared into the Pacific sky, it was no longer faith or destiny that ruled the air. It was reason, cold, unromantic, unstoppable reason, born from the wreckage of a machine that had once been too perfect. To survive, the rain over Kagoshima fell like ash. It was late 1944, and the once proud airfields of Japan had become graveyards of twisted aluminum and burnt fuel. Lieutenant Takahashi Kenji, now 30, stood on the cracked tarmac, staring at a line of young men climbing into their Zeros. Most of them were barely 20. Their uniforms were too clean, their faces too calm. They smiled the way men do when they have already accepted they will not return. The engines coughed to life and the wind from their propellers scattered puddles across the runway, mixing rain with the oil stains of hundreds who had already gone before them. Kenji was one of the few veterans left from the early campaigns, the days when the Zero ruled the skies, when victory seemed divine and endless. He remembered the laughter, the arrogance, the belief that they were invincible. Now that laughter was gone, replaced by silence. The Zero that had once been a god's weapon was now a relic forced to face machines it could no longer match. The new American fighters, the Hellcat, the Corsair, the Lightning, were faster, heavier, and merciless. Every time Kenji watched one of his students take off, he knew that within hours their planes would vanish into smoke, somewhere over the Pacific. In the barracks, pilots whispered the same phrase over and over: Zero Wakanai. The Zero doesn't come back. It had become less an aircraft than a ritual. The commanders called it honor, the pilots called it fate, and deep down everyone knew it was a sentence. The engineers in Nagoya still built them, their hands trembling as they worked under the roar of distant bombers. Jiro Horikoshi, older and sicker, now returned to the factory floor after months in the hospital. The war had taken everything from him, his health, his friends, even his illusions. The ministry had ordered modifications to the Zero: thicker skin, rubber lining, and the fuel tanks. But every change stole its soul. The aircraft became heavier, slower, clumsier, and still it burned. You can't protect a dream, Horikoshi said softly to his assistant, watching a new model roll out of the hangar. You can only bury it properly. Reports from the front arrived daily. Squadrons were destroyed, airfields erased, pilots lost without trace. For every plane that took off, 3 new ones waited to replace it, built faster, cheaper, and emptier. The metal gleamed the same, but something inside was gone. Even the paint began to fade. Fuel shortages forced the use of synthetic oil that smoked black in the sky. The same planes that once soared with elegance now coughed and wheezed like dying birds. Kenji's last flight instructor course was short. There were no tactics left to teach, no doctrines left to perfect. The manuals now contained drawings of special missions. The new word for suicide attacks, a kamikaze, the colonel told him, is not a death wish. It is the purest form of duty. Kenji said nothing. He had flown enough missions to know that purity was just another word for desperation. One evening, a boy named Sato approached him after briefing. He could not have been older than 19. Lieutenant, he asked, what does it feel like up there before you hit? Kenji looked at him, saw his own reflection in the boy's nervous eyes, and lied. Peaceful, he said. You don't feel fear, only wind. The boy nodded, smiled, and walked away. 2 days later, Sato's Zero failed to return from Okinawa. As the empire crumbled, Japan's pilots began writing letters they knew would never be read. They folded them neatly and tucked them into the corners of their cockpits. Mechanics sometimes found them after a mission that ended before takeoff when the plane exploded on the runway or was strafed by American bombers. The letters all said the same things in different words. I am not afraid. Tell my mother I became the wind. Horikoshi received one of those letters by mistake. It was addressed to the engineer who built my wings. The paper was stained with oil and blood. It read, Sensei, when I fly, I do not curse your design. It feels alive, like it wants to keep me safe. But when the bullets come, I understand. It was never meant to protect me. It was meant to make me shine before I burn. If I die, know that your machine flew perfectly. He folded it carefully and placed it inside his notebook. He did not speak for the rest of the day. In Tokyo, the air raids came every night. Sirens wailed and the factories shook as American B-29s thundered overhead. The same aluminum once used to build Zeros now melted under American firebombs, returning to the earth as ash. Horikoshi watched the flames from his window and whispered, so this is what perfection looks like when it ends. At Kagoshima, Kenji prepared for what he knew would be his final sortie. His orders were simple: escort, a formation of kamikaze bombers bound for Okinawa. He checked his oxygen mask, tightened the straps, and paused to touch the side of his plane. The metal was cold, damp from rain. We've come full circle, he said quietly, from gods to ghosts. He climbed into the cockpit and started the engine. The Zero's familiar hum filled the air, trembling between life and memory. As the formation rose into the clouds, the radio crackled with static and broken voices. One pilot began singing an old military tune, another laughed. The sky ahead glowed orange from distant fires. When the first American radar locked onto them, Kenji didn't maneuver. He simply flew straight, feeling the vibration of the engine through the seat, the smell of burning oil mixing with rain. In those last minutes he thought not of the emperor, nor victory, nor duty, but of the factory floor in Nagoya, of the man who had polished the aluminum bomb. It would shine in the sun. He saw the tracers before he heard them. A flash, a soundless explosion, and his world became light. The Zero faithful, even in death, broke apart cleanly. No fireball, no debris, just pieces of silver drifting through the clouds like falling petals. Days later, American sailors recovered fragments of wreckage floating near Okinawa. One small plate of aluminum still bore the manufacturer's mark, Mitsubishi, 1941. It had survived the explosion without a scratch. A naval officer kept it as a souvenir, unaware that it was part of the same machine that had once been called the pride of an empire. Months passed, the war ended. In the ruins of Tokyo, Horikoshi walked through what remained of his factory. The roof was gone. The walls blackened the assembly line, a tangle of twisted steel. He stopped beside a single half-built fuselage lying on its side, the rising sun insignia barely visible under soot. He reached out and touched it gently as if consoling an old friend. "You flew too far," he whispered. In his final diary entry written weeks before Japan's surrender, Horikoshi confessed what thousands of his countrymen could not say aloud. "We built a beautiful machine and filled it with brave men. But beauty is a poor shield. The Americans built armor, and we built mirrors. Ours reflected the light until it consumed us." When the war ended, only a handful of Zeros remained airworthy. Most were scattered wrecks on remote islands, silent testimonies to a nation that had confused courage with salvation. Yet for those who had flown them, there was no hatred, only reverence. "The Zero was not our killer," wrote one surviving pilot years later. "It was our teacher. It taught us that faith without reason is fire." The hangar was silent except for the echo of footsteps on polished concrete. It was 1976, 31 years after the end of the war. Inside the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum, a single aircraft sat beneath the white glare of the display lights. A restored Mitsubishi, a 6M0, its aluminum skin gleaming like new visitors passed quietly, reading plaques pointing at the kanji lettering still faintly visible along the fuselage. Most of them saw a relic, an artifact of history, but for the few who had once known its name, whispered in fear the sight was something deeper, like seeing a ghost that refused to fade. A former U.S. Navy pilot named Commander Robert Jennings stood a few paces away from the display rope, hands clasped behind his back. He had flown Hellcats in the Pacific, had watched Zeros burn over the Philippine Sea, had seen friends die in those dogfights that turned the sky into fire. Now, decades later, he found himself staring at the machine that had once defined his enemy. It looked smaller than he remembered, delicate, almost fragile. "It's hard to believe we were afraid of that," a visitor beside him murmured. Jennings didn't answer. He stepped closer, studying the thinness of the wing panels, the way the rivets glimmered like tiny scars. "You wouldn't understand," he said finally. "They built it to be perfect, not to survive." Across the hall, an elderly Japanese man watched from a bench near the exit. His name was Masaru Horikoshi, son of the engineer who had designed the Zero. He had been a child during the war, too young to remember the planes themselves, but old enough to remember the sound, the deep, steady hum that filled the sky over Nagoya when squadrons took off for the last time. When he received the museum's invitation to attend the dedication ceremony, he hesitated for weeks. Coming here, standing before his father's creation displayed under American lights, felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. And yet he had come. When the crowd thinned, Jennings noticed the old man sitting alone. Something about the man's posture, a quiet gravity of familiarity, made him walk over. "You served Jennings?" he asked gently. Masaru shook his head. "My father did," he said. "Not as a soldier, as a builder." Jennings understood instantly. "Horikoshi." The old man nodded. "He built these planes," he said softly, gesturing toward the Zero. "And then he spent the rest of his life wishing he hadn't." The two men stood together before the aircraft. Jennings spoke first. "We studied one of these back in '42. We tore it apart piece by piece." Masaru smiled faintly. I know. My father read your reports after the war. He said your engineers understood his machine better than his own superiors ever did. Jennings looked at the thin wing edges and sighed. We didn't hate it, you know. We respected it maybe too much. They fell silent. The air between them carried the strange weight of shared memory. Enemies once divided by oceans and ideology, now bound by the quiet understanding that only those who survived could share. Jennings broke the silence. When we first saw it, we thought your father was crazy. No armor? No. Ceiling, no protection. We thought it was suicide, Masaru nodded. It was, he said, but he didn't choose that out of madness. Japan had no steel, no fuel, no time. The only resource left was faith. He paused, his eyes fixed on the rising sun emblem painted on the tail. He built the Zero because he believed beauty could save us, but beauty burns. Jennings nodded slowly. Maybe it did save you, he said. Not in war, but in memory. Masaru turned to him. Surprised, Jennings continued, his voice low. You see that crowd? The kids with cameras, the families walking by. They don't see a killer. They see a story. They see what happens when men believe too much in perfection. He stepped closer to the Zero, placing one hand gently on the polished metal. This thing taught us how to win, but it also taught us what winning costs. Masaru walked beside him, his reflection faint on the fuselage. My father used to say the same thing. He whispered that every design is a mirror. Zero showed Japan its soul, and when it broke, so did we. They stood there for a long time, two old men and one machine, surrounded by the quiet hum of air conditioning and distant footsteps. Jennings finally spoke. Do you ever think machines remember? Masaru looked at him curiously. How could they? Because sometimes, Jennings said, I think they do. They carry the weight we can't. Masaru smiled a soft, weary smile. Then this one remembers too much. A guide approached announcing that the museum was closing. The two men nodded and began to walk toward the exit. Before leaving, Masaru turned back for one last look at the Zero. The light above it dimmed slightly as the staff powered down the display. For a moment, the plane seemed to breathe, its silver skin fading into shadow. It looked neither victorious nor defeated, just timeless. Jennings watched it too. We built armor, he said quietly, almost to himself. You built art. Masaru's answer was simple, and both killed men. Outside, the evening light poured through the museum's glass walls, casting long reflections across the floor. The two men shook hands before parting. Jennings looked up at the setting sun, its orange glow spreading across the sky like the emblem once painted on those wings. Maybe, he said, it's time we stop building things to die. Masaru nodded and started remembering why we built them at all. Inside, the Zero sat in silence beneath its lights, a ghost made of aluminum carrying the echoes of all who had touched it. In its stillness, it seemed to whisper the final truth of its existence, that beauty without mercy is fragile, and that every perfection hides the seed of its own destruction. Decades after its last flight, the Zero still told its story without words. A story not of conquest or defeat, but of understanding machines, after all, do not hate. They do not forgive. They only endure, waiting for men to learn what they tried to teach. The war that had once filled the skies with fire ended, not with the roar of engines, but with silence. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the rising sun flags were lowered, and the remaining Zero fighters, those still capable of flight, were ordered to stand down. A few pilots ignored the command and took off anyway, circling the airfields before landing one final time. Others wept beside their planes, resting their hands on the metal that had carried them through both triumph and ruin. Across the empire, hangars were opened to the occupying forces, revealing rows of abandoned aircraft, their fuselages riddled with bullet holes, wings drooping like the arms of fallen angels. By the time the last inventory was recorded, Mitsubishi had produced 10,900 and 390 fighters. Of those, fewer than 50 survived the war intact. The rest were gone, consumed by battles scattered across jungles, oceans, and coral reefs from Burma to the Solomons. No other aircraft in history had symbolized a nation's rise and collapse so completely. The Zero began as the embodiment of a dream to dominate the Pacific through speed, grace, and faith in the pilot's courage. It ended as the emblem of a nightmare, a weapon so pure that it demanded purity from those who flew it, even to the point of extinction. American analysts after the war studied the statistics with the same precision that had once dissected the Alton Zero. In the first year of combat, the Zero's kill ratio exceeded 12 to 1. By 1944, the ratio had reversed completely. For every American aircraft destroyed, 19 zeros were lost. The math was merciless, but the numbers alone could not explain the transformation. What had changed was not the sky nor the weapons, but the philosophy of those who built them. To the Japanese engineers of 1939, victory was beauty, an ideal expressed through form and efficiency. To the American engineers of 1943, victory was endurance strength, multiplied by numbers, discipline, and protection. Both sides had built. Masterpieces? Only one side had built for the long war. The legacy of the Zero lived on in unexpected ways. Its light aerodynamic design influenced generations of aircraft long after the empire that birthed it was gone. Its designer Jiro Horikoshi survived the war but never spoke publicly about his creation again. In his private notebooks he wrote, "The Zero was not built for killing, it was built for flight, but war corrupted its wings." When he died in 1982, a model of the Zero sat on his desk, polished clean, facing west toward the setting sun. For the men who fought against it, memory carried a different weight. American pilots, long after the fighting had ended, admitted a strange admiration for their old adversary. "The Zero was the first airplane that made me understand respect," wrote Commander Robert Jennings in his memoir, "not for what it did, but for what it dared to be." In the decades after the war, rusting pieces of the fighter kept appearing across the Pacific, washed up on beaches by storms, uncovered in jungles, or pulled from shallow reefs. Each recovery became a quiet act of remembering. Some were restored for museums, while others were buried again with the pilots who had flown them. Every piece told the same story, of men who believed too much in perfection and of a machine that reflected their faith. Today, a few Zeros can still fly. When they rise into the sky at air shows, the crowd goes silent. The engine's low growl climbs into that same sharp whine that once filled the skies over Pearl Harbor, over China, over Okinawa. The sound is beautiful, haunting, and deeply human. It carries the ghosts of both sides, the builders, the pilots, the fallen, and reminds everyone listening that every invention comes with a cost. In the end, the Zero was not a failure of engineering. It was a triumph built on a deadly mistake. The idea that perfection could replace protection, that faith alone could sustain flight. The Americans who captured it first saw only weakness, but history showed something deeper. The Zero was a masterpiece of impossible ambition, an airplane too fragile for a world that demanded strength. The narrator's voice fades as the camera lingers on old footage. Rows of Zeros lined up on airfields, pilot bowing before takeoff, the rising sun shining in their goggles. Then the same skies years later, empty, quiet, endless. The Zero did not lose because it was poorly made. It lost because it was built for a world that did not exist. In its lightness, it carried the weight of a nation's belief, and in its fire, it burned that belief away. As the final image fades, a single Zero glides silently through a museum's dim light. The story ends where it began, a beautiful machine built to die.